NASA 557, contact tower 128.15.
Caution, caution. Manual, fuel, manual, fuel.
I'm John Goglia.
I'm Greg Feith.
And I'm Todd Curtis.
And we are the Flight Safety Detectives.
Between us, we have over a century of aviation accident investigation and safety experience to draw on as we discuss issues that affect all of us.
So we are qualified to share our perspectives on accidents and incidents and what can be learned from them for the future.
We're proud to say we've got three sponsors that really relate to the topic of aviation safety: the Professional Aviation Maintenance Association, or PAMA, Piston Power, and Avemco Insurance, a world-class provider of aviation insurance.
Later on in the show, we'll tell you how you can get a 5% discount on your insurance just for listening to the show.
We don't just dissect the official reports. In every episode, we identify safety issues and take the mystery out of accident investigations.
So maybe pilots and their planes can have safer flights ahead.
Well, hello, gentlemen. It is another episode of Flight Safety Detectives. It was another sad weekend. We had a TBM, a Cicada TBM 700 single-engine turboprop, being flown by a pilot who happened to be the vice president of U.S. Banks. We don't know how accomplished a pilot he was, especially in that airplane. But unfortunately, single pilot, no passengers, on the approach to final destination. Somewhere along the line, lost control of the aircraft. It went into a vertical dive from low altitude and crashed into a residence. Fortunately, the people that live in that residence weren't home. So there were no fatalities on the ground or any injuries. It was just a single fatality in the aircraft. Todd, I know that you pulled up some of the data on this. I was following it briefly over the weekend before I was traveling, but there's a lot of factual issues that have come out so far, but there's a lot of discussion and, of course, a lot of investigation yet to be done.
And in this case, this particular accident, let's start at the end. It was going to suburban Minneapolis. And at the time, the weather forecast for the destination airport called for temperatures that were just 3 or 4 degrees above freezing on the ground. And there was an overcast area at 1,000 feet. Now, I'm not sure how thick the cloud layer was, but this was probably quite different from where he started the flight, which was in Naples, Florida. There were actually two legs that day, from Naples to Des Moines, Iowa, and then from Des Moines, Iowa to the Minneapolis area, with roughly 45 minutes or so on the ground in Des Moines, apparently just for refueling or for just a short stop. So this is a fairly long flight, single pilot operation. The last 10, 15 minutes or so, right before descending for the runway, it was at a nice steady 3,000 feet above sea level. And things went awry in a big way.
Yeah, it looked like I was doing just some rough calculations. You know, he started that descent. He was doing 5 to 650 feet per minute down, which is nominal. It's what you would expect. He is in lousy weather. I mean, it wasn't tremendously bad, but the key element was that there was a lot of moisture in those clouds, and because of the temperature and dew point spread, there was icing, in-flight icing. And I think you talked about it off air, Todd, about the fact that there was some PIREPs for light rime ice, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
And one of the things that we really had a long, lengthy discussion about, we even wrote a recommendation about trying to standardize PIREPs or pilot reports regarding icing, because light rime ice in an A320 is, moderate to severe in a Cessna 172. And one of the recommendations that we made was trying to standardize how icing conditions are reported for the category or class of aircraft so that everybody understands that an A320 reporting light rime doesn't apply to a Cessna 172, that there's got to be a different way to report it so that that information is pertinent and relevant to the pilot and their respective aircraft.
Yeah, you know, the old looking at the windshield wiper to see if it gets ice on an airliner. I mean, that's the number one indication that I heard in cockpits that many, many, many times. So, and that picking up ice like that quickly is not good for a smaller airplane.
And I mean, this airplane is certified for flight in the known ice. It typically has onboard weather radar, and of course you can pull up depending on what kind of avionics suite they had in the airplane. You know, you can get onboard, SM, XM satellite weather and things like that. But there's going to be a lot of elements here. One, single pilot. We talk about fatigue all the time. This guy took off out of Florida with an en route stop in Des Moines and was heading up to Minneapolis. We don't know what kind of 24-hour history he had with regard to rest. That's a long flight, single pilot. And now if you're flying in the goo, you're flying in bad weather, that's even more fatiguing because you are single pilot. And even though the autopilot may be flying the majority of the airplane or the flight, you still have to be a pilot in command. You still have to be doing those things. You still have to navigate. You still have to monitor weather. You still have to talk on the radio and check in with ATC. You still have to look for traffic. There's 1,000 things you got to be doing. You don't just sit back and chill. So fatigue, I would expect, in the physiological aspects. I don't know how old a gentleman this was, but you can always surmise that there is a medical condition that needs to be examined. Being single pilot, you lose the airplane due to a medical condition where you've either had a stroke, a heart attack, or anything else, you now become incapacitated. And during the course of the descent, like this airplane was, if he had turned off the autopilot, disengaged the autopilot, was hand flying when the event happened, that could explain the vertical descent. I saw a video. You can hear it sounds like the aircraft is winding up, just like you hear in these old, World War II movies with dive bombers and everything else. You can hear that the prop is starting to overspeed as the airplane descends. And then in the video, that airplane is vertical. And the three of us know that general aviation airplanes, outside of an aerobatic aircraft, general aviation airplanes are not designed to go vertical. They don't like to fly vertical. You let go of the controls, the nose will have a tendency to pitch up. It will oscillate, but it will return to a neutral stability, if you will. The question is, why did this airplane stay vertical? When I did Silk Air 737 over in Indonesia, 737 doesn't like to go vertical, but that aircraft wasn't a vertical dive. And the reason for it is because the pilot had intentionally rolled all the nose down trim in, had the aircraft at full power, had the gear up, flaps up, and speed brakes down, and literally had to be pushing on the control yoke with all the nose down trim to keep it in a vertical descent like that. So again, the NTSB is going to have their work cut out for them. One, because the airplane crashed into a house and had a post-crash fire. So a lot of good evidence may have been damaged or destroyed, especially the avionics stuff. And I know that you guys, when we were talking off the air, there are other concerns with regard to why the airplane. And I think, Todd, when you were talking about it, you saw that the aircraft had slowed down from 90 knots to 67 knots, which now falls into the range of the stall for that aircraft. But we all know flying in ice changes the shape of the wing, which now changes where that wing is going to stall. It no longer is at the prescribed angle of attack as we all know it under normal conditions for that wing to stall, which means the airplane could actually stall at a higher airspeed.
And it's also unclear, at least from my perspective, what was outside the windscreen at that time, because the ceiling was about 1,000 feet. The airport is at 900 feet above sea level. So I'm doing some quick math here. He was at about 2,500 feet above sea level when he lost control of the aircraft. So that's about what, 600, 700 feet from the bottom of the cloud deck. Very likely he was in limited visibility. You can see that very slightly makes a left turn right before he completely loses it. I'm thinking he's going straight for the runway, right in front of him. And the wind was a quartering wind from the left, about 10 knots on the surface of the airport. So why is he making this slight left turn? Is he being disoriented? Is there something else going on that we're not aware of? I don't know, but that's the one thing other than departing control flight that really stuck out. Started to make a left turn just before things went south.
And again, having learned a lot from when I did the Roselawn investigation, which involved an ATR 72 that was flying in super cool drizzle droplets, freezing rain, freezing drizzle. We found we could really dissect the performance of that particular aircraft, both with radar data and flight data recorder data. And we learned a number of things about the way aircraft ice up. One, aircraft don't ice up necessarily symmetrically. That is, you fly into an icing event, you may accumulate more ice on one wing, one tail surface, one part of the fuselage than you will on the other. It all depends on the attitude, the moisture content, temperature, and a variety of other things. In this case, if the pilot was aware it was in ice, was the ice outperforming the capability of the airplane? We've seen that where the icing is accumulating so fast that no matter what system you had, it can't keep up with shedding the ice. And I think the NTSB is going to be looking at that in that Cessna 208 Caravan up near Nome, Alaska, where there was a significant level of icing going on when that 208 flew through it. So I would expect them to be looking at that. If you do activate a de-ice system, in this particular instance, it could be whether it's a TKS system or a boot system, doesn't matter. Ice does not shed symmetrically off the aircraft. And you could have a layer of ice still on the leading edge or just after the leading edge that did not come off for whatever reason. And again, we saw this and documented it when we were doing all the testing with the ATR 72. And in some cases, you will have what's been known or characterized in the industry as a sawtooth, jagged pattern where the ice has built up, did not shed. And that too, you may have chunks of ice come off where now you have a clear part of the wing, but you still have a contaminated part of the wing. And we have to continue to think about not only the wing surfaces, but we also have to look at the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer, because you can get tailplane icing as well. On top of all of that, when you look at it, even if you have an airplane that is certified and you cycle the boots, cycle the prop, you do all of the things necessary to clear the ice, you have to remember that 9/10 of that airplane is still unprotected. We don't have boots, we don't have hot plates, we don't have TKS running up and down the fuselage to clear those portions of the fuselage or the empennage. And there are some pictures on the internet when we were doing the testing with the ATR 72, when we flew it into a plume of freezing rain, freezing drizzle that we generated out of a tanker. You can see the whole front end, and I think we even posted it on one of our previous shows about the ATR 72 in Brazil, where it shows the ice accumulation on the front end of the aircraft. And that isn't because we flew it into the tanker. That is because the pointy end of that airplane is being, exposed to that freezing rain, freezing drizzle icing event, and it's not a protected surface. So you're going to accumulate ice And we all know when you accumulate ice, it does two things. It increases the weight and it increases the drag. And it happens all over what's identified as the wetted surface. That is those unexposed or those exposed, unprotected surfaces of the aircraft. So again, as a pilot, especially single pilot, we all have to be very cognizant about flying in conditions like that. And you have to monitor temperature. That's the key here is monitoring temperature.
We're going to take a short break now to meet one of Avemco's employees from their Frederick, Maryland office.
Well, JT, I understand that you have years and years of experience in insurance business, but you're here for 2 years, is that correct?
A little over 2 years, yes.
Why did you come here?
For a change of scenery, let's say. Been in the business and industry for a long time, P&C side, underwriting claims, everything, marketing. I've worked with some of these people in the past with a prior carrier and thought it would be interesting, educational, something new I wanted to try and learn about. So I took the leap and I love it, absolutely love it.
So what makes you an expert in aviation since you're talking with pilots and trying to determine whether or not Avemco is going to insure them?
All right. The pilots themselves have been my best teachers. Speaking with the pilots over the last 2+ years has been fantastic. It's such a great learning experience, learning curve for me. I've learned so much. We've done ground school. We've had CFI come in, give us hours of ground school, worked in the simulator, going to the flight shows, different things, Sunathon, Oshkosh, do the NAFI summit, things like that, talking to the folks down there. It's been an absolutely great learning experience and a pleasure for me. I enjoyed it immensely.
So what's been really the most challenging element of this business now that you're on the aviation side?
Learning the ins and outs of the planes. The underwriting side, I know how to underwrite. I get the information I need from people, but learning about the types of planes that we're insuring, that was the biggest learning curve. And I think I've got a pretty good grasp on that now from talking to the pilots and in-house education. So that was the biggest challenge, going from, say, commercial buildings to Cessnas or Pipers or something like that.
And now, back to the flight safety detectives.
So, Greg, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
You have experience that we don't. You have flown fairly high performance aircraft, solo, pilot, long distances. So the kind of length of flight that we had today from Naples, Florida to Minneapolis, you've done things like that several times. Take us through your mental process of how do you prepare for a single pilot operation? Morning takeoff, which means you probably are 2 or 3 hours ahead of time doing prep, checking out the airplane. We're talking a long day. So take us through a typical situation like this.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't fly when the Wright brothers were flying like John. So, but I didn't always have the benefit of using an app like ForeFlight. You got to pick charts. You've got to look at the prog charts. You have to really do an in-depth weather study. But the bigger thing is really knowing how to talk to the flight service station briefer. They have all of the weather data along your route of flight at their disposal. You just have to be prepared and astute enough to ask the questions of that flight service station briefer so that you're adequately prepared. You take off out of Florida, it's, severe clear, 102 and sky is blue. And destination, the weather may be good, but it's always the in-between that can get you. And you really have to understand it. But when we're flying in these kinds of conditions, and this isn't pure wintertime condition, you can get in-flight icing any time of the year, anywhere in the United States because of altitude and saturation, moisture in the atmosphere. John, you remember the accident. It was an Embraer 120 down in coming out of Nassau, I think out of the Bahamas or somewhere down south over the Atlantic Ocean. They iced up that airplane and lost control of the airplane.
Yep. You have to assume this guy, given the cost of the airplane, must have had all the electronic aids that are available. It comes with radar, and if he had the weather on, because he wasn't on the ground that long to be playing with the weather reports.
Yeah.
What did you say, Todd? 26 minutes on the ground?
26, 36. It was much less than an hour.
The other thing, a lot of these pilots, John, when you're talking about playing with the weather, a lot of these guys have XM satellite weather, and again, whether it's XM or one of the other weather services, you have a latency problem. There is a delay. You have to really understand what weather information that you're actually looking at and painting, because what shows up on your iPad is not necessarily real time. 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes old will put you in a place you don't want to be. And we've seen a number of accidents. We had an in-flight breakup of a Pilatus down in Florida, where the pilot who thought he was going through a hole when in fact he flew right through the heart of a thunderstorm and tore his airplane apart. We've seen that over and over and over again. This is nothing to be taken lightly. And you're flying a $1 or $2 or $3 million machine like that, and you have all that whiz-bang equipment on the aircraft. You better know how to use it and interpret the data. Plus, you have air traffic control. If you have questions, you can always talk to the center controller, and they'll give you advisory frequencies to get updated weather along your route or at destination. You can go to flight service station frequencies. Again, I don't think as pilots, when we looked at accidents, and I'm sure that I would hope that the NTSB and the FAA will be looking at it in this case for lessons learned. What tools did this pilot actually use to help influence proper decision-making, ADM? If you just, got up to altitude, pointed it, turned the autopilot on and sat back until he had to make the descent, then I've got real issues with that, because you've got to be checking the weather all the time. Today, coming out of Denver, it was fine coming out of Denver en route, but it was obvious that we were going to be running into some convective activity as soon as we got to the East Coast. We were still at altitude, but the captain came on and said, yeah, we're going to get banged around a little bit, so seatbelts on and flight attendants in their seats. You look out the window and it's severe clear out there, but that the atmosphere is churning. And again, that's what being a pilot is all about, is staying engaged and being prepared and really understanding the environment that you're operating in or going to operate in, so that you are prepared for that environment.
Yep. Like I say in the closing, the weather here, there, and everywhere in between. And we see accidents over and over and over again where it appears that the pilots disregarded that kind of basic information, and they just check where they're going and assume it's the same en route.
I wanted to make an assumption about the state of mind of the pilot. I'm assuming, given his position at the bank, which I believe is headquartered in Minneapolis, and the length of the flight he already did that day, the 2 flights, I'm assuming this was his destination airport. Again, less than 3 or 4 minutes away from touching down and taxiing in. After a long day, and Greg, and again, I'm going to defer to you. What are the things you have to guard against mentally when you're in that situation? You can smell your home airport. You can imagine yourself getting in your car and going home and sleeping in your own bed. What goes through your head that you have to push to the side?
He may have been coming back for some May Day at the bank. He may have been coming back may have been on vacation. They got to look at that. Why was he down there? And if he had to come back for some sort of a pressing business arrangement, he might have had his head wrapped around his meeting that day or the next day and not paying it the proper amount of attention to his flight.
Yeah, and it breeds complacency as well. Why? Because you got a technically advanced aircraft, you got all the whiz-bang stuff you need. You really just point and shoot, if you will, except when it comes to the approach. And since, today's avionics, you can fly the entire approach because it's all programmed in if you understand how the avionics works. And in this case, That airplane is, as I know it, doesn't have an auto throttle. And just like the Continental Express accident up in Buffalo, they came out of altitude, they descended, they had to pull the power back to make the descent. They leveled at 1600, the autopilot was on, but oops, they forgot to push the throttles up. And of course, the airplane, the energy state slowed down. The autopilot tried to hold altitude by rolling in that nose up trim to try and hold altitude. And then it finally gave up because there just was insufficient thrust to sustain flight. And now they're battling a bucking bronco when the airplane stalled. And the pilot in that case, that airplane has not only a stick shaker, but a pusher. And so, of course, the pusher pushes the nose down to get the wing flying again. He panicked and pulled against the pusher. So now he's fighting an airplane rather than unloading the wing so they can get it flying again. Why? Because he didn't understand the airplane, didn't understand aerodynamics, and didn't understand the system. These are the little things. It's not big things that'll hurt you or kill you as a pilot. It's the small things. It's the lack of understanding. Just knowing it doesn't work. You really have to fundamentally understand the systems of your aircraft. And again, how that aircraft will respond in certain situations.
In fact, some of that scenario that you just painted looks like it may be occurring here because the speed there right at the end before he flipped over, 60 to 70 miles an hour, knots,
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't steady. So it was sort of moving all over the place. So it may very well be that when he came down, he tried to level off and the ice and whatever caught up with him. And the power
Todd,
went still back.
yeah, and I think, Todd, you said that there was something in the flight path data that showed that the airplane was in a slight left turn or roll or bank before
That's
it actually
correct.
went over on its back.
Just a few seconds before it totally lost altitude, it was going straight and true, due east almost, and was making just a very slight turn during the descent, very slight turn to the left, and then
But he was also going too slow there.
it was slowing down. It was in the descent. It was slowing down to the mid 60s and possibly right at the end, it just above 63, 64 knots.
Yeah,
And
and
he
That's
probably
ground
didn't
speed.
have any of his devices out. Flaps were probably up. And I don't believe there's leading edge devices on this airplane. So
And this was ground speed,
we
not airspeed, but given the wind direction, the airspeed might have been on the order of 70.
And so again, and that's where the NTSB performance study will be so critical because they can actually determine if that was actually a bank or a skid or a slip or a yaw into, the aircraft was yawing left because of torque. There's thousands. So the NTSB's aircraft performance report will be very critical in really telling the story and then taking those factual bullets, if you will, and trying to backdrive it into the pilot's operation and understanding of what was going on at various times during the final portions of the approach. That's how you build that storyline. It's obvious that the pilot lost control. The question is why? And I really get tired of reading. I don't know who proofreads articles for aviation magazines, newspapers, or whatever, but they always talk about the airplane is doing this, that, and the other, and the airplane lost control. The airplane is an inanimate object. It can't lose control. The pilot loses control of the aircraft. Airplanes just do what the pilot wants it to do. So it'll be real interesting to see why the pilot lost control of his aircraft.
Now, Greg, want to ask you for another question or two. Again, not only are you a pilot of high performance aircraft, you're also a flight instructor. And for technically advanced aircraft, especially those that are common today, and we also have the electronic flight bag, our ForeFlight, in our hands. And there's a tendency, at least on my part, to trust I can get all the information I need about weather, about conditions. How important is it to get on the phone and actually talk to a human being about your plans?
Oh, I think it's absolutely important because you aren't left to really interpreting the data. You're you're having an expert help interpret what the data says and provide you with that information. I mean, if you look at the airlines, if you remember Palm 90, Air Florida, okay, one of the big issues that was developed by the NTSB was that those pilots were making autonomous decisions. They did not seek the advice and guidance from dispatch or the company. Those two pilots made the decision to take off in weather conditions that were not conducive for, successful flying in their particular instance, as far as de-icing and things like that. After that, we now have joint decision making. Why? Because the dispatcher and the pilots make a joint decision about blasting off or not. If it really takes, and I know a lot of business aviation and charter operators, you start with your dispatch department. If it's really a questionable, you may get the chief pilot or the director of flight ops involved in the conversation. But you have multiple perspectives reviewing some level of weather, not just depending on yourself and possibly your misinterpretation or lack of understanding of what the weather information that you may get off of a ForeFlight or DUOTS or some other source. Your interpretation may not be the most correct interpretation of the weather.
The charter company that I work for, we required them to do that weather evaluation separately and then share it with each other. And if it didn't agree, then it kicked it up another level of intensity to see where it disagreed and why.
Yeah. Yeah, because again, in what we've learned with freezing rain and freezing drizzle in the atmosphere is you're talking a temperature spread of a 0.5 degree Celsius. A 0.5 degree. That's all it takes to go from basically an icing event to a super cool drizzle droplet where the water droplet is substantially below freezing, and it is still suspended in the atmosphere, and it doesn't actually solidify until it strikes your aircraft. And you may think you're flying in, weather or, rain, but in fact, you're flying in these super cool drizzle droplets and things like that. So that's why, again, now is the time to refresh yourself with picking up one of the handbooks from the FAA or getting online, watching some YouTube videos about flying in spring and summertime weather, because again, you can still run into ice. And in this case, it'll be interesting to see if icing was the prime event, which I suspect it was.
Let me ask you, both of you, this question, because having been in the middle of NTSB investigations, investigating issues like this, how likely do you think it is the current iteration of the NTSB will ask the kinds of questions we're asking here and give decent answers?
If they watch this show, Todd, we just gave them a bunch.
Yeah.
And I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's naive about these things. As much as I've flown, this is the kind of flight I've never done. So I'm looking at this as someone who doesn't know anything about how to perform a flight like this. And those are the questions that are coming out of my mouth.
And see, the good thing is, Todd, your ego doesn't walk too far in front of you that you wouldn't ask those questions.
On this subject, no.
And so, but you got $1 million or $2 million airplane, there's an expectation that goes along with the fact that you've got this airplane, you have these capabilities, you've had this quote training, you should be able to do all of the requisite things to ensure the high success of flying from point A to point B. But again, single pilot IFR is the hardest flying out there.
Well, the fact that he had an instrument rating alone in this airplane tells you that he spent some money training. So
yeah,
doesn't mean it stuck, but it means he sat through some classes and did some flying with somebody.
Or he had heads down, looking at his approach on ForeFlight or whatever, studying, and not, again, monitoring what's going on that instrument panel. I mean, for the speed to bleed off 30 knots in a very short period of time says he wasn't plugged into watching his airspeed. He was doing or possibly doing something else.
Well,
If he was medically fit to be flying.
well, part of this, the flight profile leads itself to that. So he was at some altitude, took a 650 feet per minute dive, not a dive, but a controlled descent, and then he was leveling off. Maybe he was looking to see what his next step was going to be,
Yeah.
and he was heads down, not looking at his instruments. He couldn't see the ground. We know that he wasn't. He was right at the bottom of the ceiling, so maybe he wasn't paying enough attention.
And
A lot of unanswered questions, some of which the NTSB or any other investigative body will never be able to answer. You know, if there was ice on the body of the airplane, it's gone. If there was ice on the wings, it's gone. The configuration of the airplane, they'll be able to figure out if he had flaps up or down or landing gear. Didn't look like the landing gear was down in the video.
No, because he was still what, 6 miles or so from the airport, so he wouldn't have gotten the airplane configured.
But at 6 miles from the airport, you're starting to think about landing.
Yeah, and you're preparing not only the airplane but yourself.
Right.
He is flying the approach. He's got to be familiar with, okay, if I'm off the approach, I've got to go missed. And what am I going to do if I go missed? And so you're doing that while you're still trying to be a pilot. You're still talking on the radio, and you're still navigating. You know, so yeah, there are a lot of things going on, and that's why, you know, it really takes mental preparation and being in a good state of mind when you're going to be flying hard IFR single pilot.
Well, the NTSB is going to have their hands full with this one, and there'll be a lot of pressure on them, self-imposed pressure, more than anything else, because of the high value of the passenger on the pilot on the airplane.
Yeah, and that shouldn't dictate the quality of investigation. You know, it doesn't matter who's on the aircraft, because the level of investigation should always be thorough and methodical, because we owe it to family and friends to get it right. And, you know, I don't care if this guy, you know, was an executive at a bank. I don't care if it was Joe Schmuckatelli, the milkman who was flying the airplane. The quality of the investigation should always be the same.
Yeah, but then you plug in the managing director who has to look at the budget of the NTSB, and sometimes they, you know, dole out the resources with a teaspoon instead of a tablespoon.
Yeah, well,
It's only human nature. The budget's not unlimited. So you got to spread out and try to do as much as you can with whatever you have available.
But John, years ago, when I first went to work for the board was doing 4,000 accidents a year. Now they're doing 12, maybe 1,300. They have a bigger budget.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think the board went sideways some years ago, and this chairman inherited a bucket of problems,
yeah,
so to speak. I mean, and the budget hasn't been adjusted. This year in the proposal, there's finally new money put in her budget. Right? But there wasn't new money in the recent years past.
Well, hopefully they'll get it right with this one, because the industry is looking. And in fact, just full disclosure, next month, the beginning of next month, I am the keynote speaker giving a presentation to the TBM, or Owner Pilot Association, through AVEX, who does primarily maintenance on the TBMs, because their annual conference is in Denver. So there's going to be a lot of questions. You're going to have a lot of very accomplished pilots who fly that, but there's also going to be speculation abound. And that's why it's so necessary to get the facts correct right now so that we can, quell some of that speculation and really get to the learning lessons, if you will, from this accident.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we've run our course as far as we can go with this one, and we'll have to update it as more information comes available.
Yep.
And we just released today some more information from the Canadian accident. I was just looking at it just before we got together for this one, and they've got 8 points that they released that they're going to be looking at least 8 points. So we'll have to spend a little bit of time looking over what they've released and see if it's changed our mind. One of the things that I picked out immediately was they said that in those last minute of flight, there were no automatic warnings from the airplane. So that means a high rate of descent or any of the other problems that you get on landing and you get an oral warning for didn't occur. So that begs a lot of questions.
Well, again, there's been a lot of speculation. The flight profile down the chute may have been, perfect. It may not really have gone to hell in a handbasket, if you will, until, the aircraft got to 150 feet and then all hell broke loose. And, you got an airplane that's, the bottom has fallen out because of the wind gusts and things like that. So everything has to be kept in context. Throwing factoids out, and unfortunately, the NTSB recently threw a bunch of factoids out, and people built storylines around those factoids that weren't in context. And again, you can't do that. I still haven't heard the answer in the midair about what happened between the captain who was being checked and the check airman or instructor pilot when they called the disparity between the altimeters. What's the procedure? Well, I know what the procedure is because I talked to some military people that fly those helicopters. They should have, started turning circles to figure out why there was a disparity between the two altimeters to see whose was right and whose was wrong before they continued on Route 1 and Route 4. Just blast blindly into these events. You wouldn't expect two airline pilots that if there was a disparity coming down the chute at 500 feet looking for stabilized approach, and Todd calls 400 and I call 600, and we just the hell with it. We split the difference, just keep going. It doesn't work that way. And I'm still waiting to hear what was on the CVR. How did they resolve it? Did they resolve it? They just said, here's the facts, that she said this, he said that. Okay, great, but what does that mean in the grand scheme of things?
Yep, you got to put it all together.
Yeah. So with that, Todd, I will leave you with our second to the last one.
Well, the second to the last word is based on how I've been behaving in this show. Asking innocent questions. If you don't know, or you're unsure, or you're doing it for the first time, don't hesitate to ask somebody something.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Look, there are a lot of resources out there. Use them. That's what they're there for. Use them. And with that, John, I will leave you with our last word.
And the last word will be the same as it always is. If you're going to go flying, do a good job of pre-planning before you get to the airport. Do it again at the airport. If it doesn't agree, dig into it and find out why. When you get out to your airplane, do a good pre-flight. Right? And interestingly, just last week in DC, I had an airline pilot, had a nice conversation with him about pre-flights. And I raised some points with him that he was a little weak on, shall we say.
Yeah.
And anyway, so do a good pre-flight. If you want to double check yourself, or do you want to get reassured that you're doing a good one, get a mechanic that works on the airplane. And he'll give you 10 or 15 minutes to give you a quick walk around, especially on opening panels, what you should be looking for. That's one of my questions that I ask flight crews all the time. You open the panel, what were you looking for? And I always get the same blank stare. Right? So you need to pay attention. And after you get in the air, put that head on a swivel, because we still have crowded skies, especially if you're flying GA on an airport that has a lot of training facilities, or even one. Right? There's people, students in the air that are weak in a number of areas. So, keep your eyes open so you can keep your distance. And please, please fly safely.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. We really value all of our listeners and subscribers. Our podcast gets ranked by you. So if you like this, give us 5 stars inside your podcast platform.
We want to keep the conversation going with you. So we'd love for you to engage with us on our social media channels. We're on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course YouTube.
You can email the show at flightsafetydetectives@gmail.com. By the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, we're working on growing this channel, and it really helps if you all comment. So please do that. We read them all.
And be sure to subscribe.
Not all aircraft insurance policies and premiums are the same. As the only direct writer in the market, Avemco never uses third-party insurance agents and instead connects you directly with an aviation underwriter in their Frederick, Maryland office, ready to solve problems and to approve coverage based on what you fly and how you fly it. Avemco provides lightning-fast quotes, competitive rates, and personalized policies that are easy to read and tailored to you. Call 888-879-0389 for your free quote, or visit avemco.com/flightsafety. Don't forget to tell them you're a listener of our podcast and save 5%.
Premium credits are subject to underwriting guidelines, including Avemco recognized training and memberships.